Welcome back to another episode of EDI Wednesday, where we at the Institute for Equity University Center provide real meaningful discourse and debate about EDI issues in education and society. This morning, we are delighted to be joined by Frances Akinde, who is a member of the Institute, a former head teacher, and now a consultant and author. Frances, welcome.
Thank you, Paul. Nice to be here. Nice to see you.
And you. Francis, before we get into this serious discussion about race and SEND and intersectionality and allyship and bystander, the things that are important to you, the things that you're working on, I'm just going to cede the floor to you to just tell our audience and our viewers a little bit about yourself. Anything you feel you want to share.
Gosh, I am a education consultant, as you said. I specialize in looking at the intersectionality between race and send, particularly because of my own experiences with my children. I have 5 boys, and navigating the education system for them and their challenges around that has been quite something. So I basically decided to myself that the way I was going to navigate it was to be the expert in the room. So I initially trained as a Senko, and then I moved into local authority work, and then as a head teacher, and then my most recent role was as a local authority inspector and advisor for SEND across a large local authority. So I look at that dual lens experience of lived experience and professional expertise, which I think I tick both boxes. And especially I'm neurodivergent myself, and I developed hearing loss in my late 40s. So it's really important to me to kind of think about both those angles and what that means for us in education.
Thank you, Frankie. And I think you've touched on something really important there as families as experts, where you had to navigate some complexities within the school system for your sons. And part of what I've been saying to many schools as I travel around the country to talk about how to work with families is, families are there, including the young people, not only to be tapped for um, trip money for trips or when there's a problem, but they are there to be tapped as resources in teaching and learning and for advancing the work in our school. So I like the fact that you've started right at that place where families should be valued as experts. And I wondered whether you've got any messages back to schools.
Yeah, it's absolutely that. Relationships are everything. And especially when you're talking to families from racially marginalized groups, we don't trust the system. We don't trust the education system because we've had the whole history of being made to feel less, and especially when we look at, educationally subnormal schools and just all this rhetoric around the development of black children, the adultification, the bias. We need to know that we can have that relationship in schools, that they're going to listen to us when we're talking about the needs of our children. Because when it comes to advocacy, I'm very passionate about advocacy and child advocacy, because I meet so many families from marginalized communities that don't know the system. Working class families, racially minoritized families that do not have the contacts, and the expertise to know how to navigate the system. And too many times we're seeing it coming down to luck, or if you get a Senko that understands, or doesn't have that bias. But we have to talk about that bias and that gatekeeping, which means that not all our children and young people get the support that they need to succeed.
You mean to say, if I
Yeah,
hear you correctly, that
yeah.
some Senkos um, might in their practice um,
Mm.
do things, whether wittingly or unwittingly, that could lead to further marginalization of black kids.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is what we see when we look at, let's say, for example, when we look at EHCPs. we know black children are more likely in some instances to be diagnosed with SEN needs, but that's particularly around SEMH. So what we're seeing is that people are looking at behaviour first. So SEMH, social emotional mental health difficulties, people are not necessarily looking at that underlying need. And we have to talk about bias in education. And I have to say at the same time, being a Senko is a very difficult role. You know, you are stuck in the middle of navigating and supporting families, supporting class teachers, supporting the leadership team, and trying to do your best for all children. So naturally, the children that come to your attention are the ones that you're going to support first. So it's thinking about how do we think about that bias that can go on to think, well, it's not autism, it's not ADHD, it's behavior, and not looking at that underlying need. So I think really importantly, we saw this in a big way when it came to teacher assessed grades. And Ofcol did a study into assessment, and they found that there was a lot of bias in assessment. So this is something that has come, you know, to the forefront of our thinking, of our understanding, not necessarily from racially minoritized groups, from everybody saying we need to tackle that bias in education, which means outcomes, particularly for Black Caribbean boys and Gypsy Roma traveller children, are lower. We can't just say, oh, it's down to the children. We need to look at all systems and really reflect on ourselves to say, why is this happening?
I think that's a really good point, and I'm glad that you have highlighted the work of good Senkos who are doing the work that they are paid to do because it's such a huge amount of responsibility. And many Senkos up and down the country would be utterly incensed that they feel they are being criticized by parents. But again, they couldn't argue with you as you've had this experience, both as a head teacher but also as a parent of five boys who have passed through the school system. You 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 also talked about having the professional expert in the room, and so you talk about families as expert, but also the professional as expert in the room. And what has that meant? You being in the room as a family, as an expert parent, but also as a professional. What has that done for you in you being able to secure resources for your children, but also what has that done for you in terms of being able to push back on misguided assumptions and so on within schools?
Yeah, that's exactly that. A lot of times, the narrative that is being painted isn't the true narrative. And I'm able to push back and say, well, let's look at the whole picture. Let's look at the whole child. And I even had this yesterday when I was in a school, and I was like, what does that mean for the whole child? Where they were looking at specific needs. And a lot of the time, you know, when we're looking at the graduated approach, we're thinking about what do we need to put in place? Has it worked? What are the next steps? And a lot of the time, something might be put in place and it doesn't work, so that's the end of it. And it's that pushback to say, okay, as somebody who has that experience, you've tried this, that hasn't worked. What else can you try? And it's just, you know, keep pushing on. What we find is that a lot of children from parents from working class and racially minoritized groups, they don't necessarily have the language to push back. They don't necessarily, you know, feel like they can push through. A lot of black men, for example, may not go into schools because they're seen as being aggressive or confrontational when they're trying to advocate for their children. So we don't have that awareness, that cultural bias is there. So as a black educator who's experienced in SEND, I'm able to go in and say, this is what this looks like, this is what we see, this is what we expect to be put in place. So literally just now, in between us talking, I had a phone call from another parent saying that, you know, their case has been closed, you know, they're not getting that support. And I'm able to push back and say, no, actually, this is what you're entitled to. You need to go back and say, this is what you need. And the system is so stretched that unless somebody is pushing and trying to get attention, they just get forgotten, unfortunately. But it's part of that wider, you know, interactive factors that are going on within SEND at the moment.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, and here at the Institute for Equity University Center, we ourselves are beginning to think critically about how we could increase our work within SEND and both within the school sector and also um, within leadership in industry and so on. And I wonder whether you think there needs to be more awareness amongst leaders in all industries around send and intersectionality, send and inclusion and race and class and so on, and also whether you feel um, an organization like ours has a role to play in that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I get contacted all the time by parents to say that they're really struggling with their children. They want to know how to support them at home. So, and they want to know how to support them in school. So I get contacted by schools, by individual teachers, by Senkos, by school leaders around that support. But then with parents, it's thinking, how can I support them outside school? But also with businesses and organizations to say, how do I support my neurodivergent staff? So one of the best things that I did was when I left headship in 2022, I was like, I need a break from education, but I still want to be involved in children and young people or teaching. So I found this opportunity as an assistive technology trainer looking at technology and how to use it to support people in the workplace. I retrained as a workplace adjustments assessor with the British Dyslexia Association. So I was able to give support to people in the workplace around their needs, working with PhD students, university students, through the Disability Students Allowance, and also with people who are getting access to work. That taught me so much about the lack of knowledge within organizations as well. And I've actually been asked to do some talks with organizations for their neurodiversity groups to help them understand how they can advocate for their children as well, because that stress of advocating for your child impacts on your work life, having to take time off, if your child's been excluded or suspended or refusing to go into school. We see that more and more. So it's really important that organisations are aware of how they can support their employees as parents and carers and for their own needs as well.
And finally, before we take a break, 'cause I wanted to you to reflect on this thing. In my from my knowledge and my awareness, there are only 5 studies in the last 25 years in the UK that have looked at race and SEND in education. So race and special education needs and disability. And yet there is such a interlocking relationship between race and SEND. And why do you think there is this paucity of research in this area?
It hasn't been seen as a priority. And if we go right back to 2002, when we were looking at exclusion rates amongst black students, there was a study by the DFE, a report, sorry, by the DFE, and it was called Getting It Right. And the conclusion was that it's really difficult to talk to schools without mentioning racism. But schools, as soon as you say the word racism, everybody gets prickly and they're like, no, 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 I'm not racist. It's difficult to have that conversation. So there's been a lot more work in America done around it. And I was fortunate to kind of go to New York back in May and meet with the Department for Education, see what they're doing around race and send over there. It's completely different from England. So what I'm looking at, like you said, the 5 studies around it are all looking at the discrete framework where they've combined disability and critical race theory and looking at that. They're all from the same people, and it's that whole group looking at what does that mean for us in England. We haven't quite got there in terms of those studies. So I've been looking at how we can build on that specifically for education using the discrete framework and I'm actually working on a book specifically around race and send, where I said we need to do this with conversations from every single expert that I know in the field. So, and in terms of gatekeeping, that's really important to me. So I was like, I'm not going to go to who I think are the experts. I'm going to put a call out. So I had 55 people that signed up to do these conversations with me around my book, and finally that came down to 35 that I had conversations with. That's a massive study, and normally when we're looking at a paper we might maybe have 5 or 10 as a sample group. I had 35 educators who were talking about the intersection between race and send, and just the information they gave me was just brilliant. So to me, that's the solution. Looking at what I've been looking at, the studies that I've been doing through it, and then that dual lens. So I've also started a different series around talking to neurodivergent school leaders. Well, it's neurodiversity and mental health, and having conversations with them around leadership in schools, what that looks like from their lens, having neurodiversity themselves. So to me, this is going to be a massive piece of work where I can use that information to like think about the solutions around the lack of knowledge and evidence that we've got at the moment. So I'm really looking forward to that being published and people being able to, use that for themselves, really, to start those conversations in schools.
Thank you, Francis. Fascinating. My producer is already telling me wrap up, wrap up. So we are going to take a quick break to hear from our sponsors. But before we do that, um, just a summary of the things we've talked about: the importance of families as experts, the importance of the professional expert in the room, the gatekeepers, and the role of the SENCO, Special Education Needs Coordinator, adultification of Black children, how our education system has made many Black kids subnormal and continues to do that till this day. Let's look at the whole child. Let's look at how we support parents, and let's identify the support needs that they have so that they can better support their young people with special education needs. Bring multiple voices and multiple experts to the table, including the voices of head teachers and teachers who themselves are neurodivergent. Make race a priority and SEND a priority, and of course, provide staff and teachers with support. Fascinating discussion we've had in the last 17 minutes. Producer, over to you for a quick break.
My friends, welcome to the Institute for Equity University Center. I want to talk to you a little bit about our institutional support package. Many of you have heard me talk before about our training package, but not so much about our institutional support. In our institutional support package, we do a lot of audits, curriculum audits, policy audits, textual and material audits. So we audit books for publishers and for organizations that want to produce material. This is another area of our work that we want you to get involved with. If you're doing a research project and you want somebody to sit on your board as your project advisor board, or if you are just thinking about embedding EDI in your organization and you're unsure, make us your accountability partner. We will sit with you, we'll hold hands with you, we will walk with you and walk beside you through the process as partners in the great struggle and the great opportunity.
Welcome back. Welcome back. Fascinating conversation we've been having this morning with Frances Akinde, member of the Institute for Equity University Center, former head teacher, SEND consultant, and so much more. Francis, welcome back. I want
Thank
to
you.
talk a little bit about your other area of work, which is around allyship and bystander intervention and so on. Many people hear the word bystander, many people hear the word allyship, but they don't quite know what these things mean. So maybe we could start there. What does it mean to be a bystander? What does it mean to be an ally?
Yeah, I'll explain it by giving the history of why I do this work. So I was a head teacher in a special school for children with autism and associated difficulties. So some of my students had significant needs. I had a student that unfortunately passed away in September, a white female student. The support from the local authority was really good. They came in, education psychologists, everything. And then, unfortunately, 3 months later, I lost another student, a black male student, no support whatsoever. I'd been fighting for support for him for a few months before that, and nothing was done. That's when I really learned about allyship, advocacy, and the bystander effect, because people just left me to it. They were so
So do
scared
you,
about
can I
their
just,
own. Yeah, yeah,
sorry to interrupt you there. So do you
yeah,
think
yeah.
the lack of support came because of the black child, or because maybe the support architecture in the local authority had changed?
Both. They didn't see it as a priority to support him, and that was the most disappointing thing. They said that they couldn't justify the support, and his parents were asking for help, and they weren't being given any help. I had that connection with his parents because they were Nigerian. My husband's family are Nigerian. We were able to have that conversation. They trusted me to advocate for their son. And unfortunately, the local authority didn't see that as important. They'd already lost two students with autism within the local authority, and that was deemed again to be because of a lack of support, a lack of care. And so they didn't want people to know about this case as well. And I talk very openly about it now because I just couldn't let it go. I felt like I had to be an ally to his parents and stand with them and really advocate for their son. So it ended up being a massive story on the BBC, and they asked me to represent them for that. And to me, that's a classic example of what that means when we're talking about allyship, when we're talking about advocacy, when we're talking about the bystander effect. Allyship means that you see a cause, you see something that's happening, and you want to stand with someone around it. Advocacy is going one step further and making sure that you're representing them, that you're making noise about something. And the bystander effect is more about just doing nothing, just saying, well, somebody else will do that, someone else will step in, someone else will talk about that. And I think for me, what was so painful about it was the expectation was that the local authority are ultimately responsible for children with EHCPs legally. So what support, that support you'd expect the family to get, the support you'd expect the school to get, the support you'd expect the young person themselves to get just wasn't there on all levels. And the excuses that were made, to me, that's the bystander effect. Make it that, just thinking to yourself, somebody else will do that. And I was really interested in the kind of psychology of that, and why people like me will just dive right in there, regardless of our personal sacrifices. We're like, no, this is an injustice. We have to, look at this and get something done. And that led me to kind of researching around the history of the bystander effect, looking at Kitty Genovese, and, who was a young lady who was murdered in New York. And, New York, very highly populated, high rise flats, and the narrative was that people didn't come out to support her. So that was started the whole studies around the bystander effect. And then looking at a more local context in terms of the UK, we had the Susie Lampew case, where she was an estate agent that went missing in the 80s. She had an appointment in her diary to say that she was going to meet someone. Her friend saw her getting into a car with this person and just thought, oh, there's Susie, she's going to see somebody. Again, that's the bystander effect. And obviously her friend, had to live with that regret of, oh, why didn't I just stop? Why didn't I just ask who that was? Why didn't I? And her body was never found. That was the last time that she was seen. So the Susie Lampew Trust, they have started training, so you can get free training on the bystander effect and how to step in when you see people who might need support and you're feeling conscious as to how to step in and how to give them that support. So when all of that happened with me, I came across this training and I did it, and it was brilliant. And it was looking at the 5 Ds of bystander intervention, really simple, and what you can do. So this has been rolled out by several companies, but it originally comes from a company called Right to Be, who are a massive charity in America that specifically train around the bystander effect. So if you hear people talking about the 5 Ds, they have the original ownership around that. So I just decided to do lots of work around that. And as people started to hear about my work, I was asked to go into schools to talk about what the bystander effect means for bullying, and helping children to be allies to each other, to support each other when things are happening. So I started to do workshops in schools around that, specifically looking at bullying and discrimination. And that's how my work around that area started. So as you can hear, I'm very passionate about doing that work. And I strongly believe that if we teach everyone, how to be advocates and stand up for each other, the world would be a better place. So I'm very passionate about social justice in that way.
Um, uh, we have only 5 minutes left, but I can hear the the audience and the viewers salivating because they want to hear the 5 Ds. You mentioned the 5 Ds, but you haven't told them what the
Yeah,
5 Ds are.
yeah, they'll have to read my book to find out.
But the 5 Ds are not your 5 Ds, so you could tell them.
I don't want to tell them because I want them to read my book and just see how to implement it. I want them to do the Susie Lampew training, and because it's free, everyone can do it. So I want them to do that and support those organizations so they really know how to put it in place. So yeah, read all about it. Do the course.
Right, right, right. Well, we have only 2 minutes left, and I wonder if you want to just, I mean, in my own work, I talk about white sanction, which is a
Yeah,
form of allyship.
yeah, yeah.
And I wonder if you see any crossovers between people in power, whether they are
Mm,
white or black
mm,
or Asian or
yeah, yeah.
whatever other nationality. Because it is that notion of white sanction, it is that responsible use of power, isn't it?
Yes,
And
absolutely.
and I wonder if you see any crossover then between what I articulate in my own work and the need
Yeah,
for
yeah.
allyship.
You know what you just said there is so important, and this is discussion I was having with somebody the other day, where she quoted something that I'd said that I didn't realize I'd said, and she said, "You said to me that it's important for you to get into a position of power so that you can make effective change, systemic change." And when she said that, that's exactly it. When we're thinking about the majority in the UK are white men in those positions of power, and how do we, it's kind of like we have to, get into those positions so we can have that power share ourselves. What we're finding is we're not being given that power, so we have to do it ourselves. But what I'm finding is that so many people are fighting for power, they're not working together. So my work is very much as a collective, what can we do together to make sure that we're in positions of power to affect change? And like you said, I think that power share is so unequal. When people get a bit of power, they don't want to share it with people, other people from marginalized groups. They want to be in those positions themselves. So we kind of do it to ourselves as well. And nobody wants to talk about that. The fact that we do that to ourselves and we stop ourselves from advancing because we're not working together and things. So I think it's such an important topic to talk about, and how, as I said, my work is around getting myself into a position of power so I can bring other people with me to affect change.
Maybe the next time we have you on, we can talk about how we fight for power, how we scramble for power, and how that fight now fragments the cause and the solidarity. Francis, this has been a
Absolutely.
fascinating conversation. Let me just quickly summarize before I ask you the quick fire question. So we've talked about we need to tackle differential support in schools and treat our learners and our staff through an equity-based lens. We need to stand up against injustices of all kinds, regardless of our identity characteristics, and I think that is really important. So men can advocate for women, able-bodied people can advocate for on behalf of disabled people, and we have Muslims advocating for Jews, and Jews advocating for Muslims, and Christians advocating for those without any faith, and so on. But it's use your identity characteristics that give you power to advocate, and that notion of the you know the responsible use of power, I think is that allyship piece. And the final thing I heard you saying, if not me, then who? And I think that's really something important for us to. So before we zoom out of this virtual space, and wrap up, there's some quick fire questions that I want to ask you, some light questions. So what was your last Google search?
Wow, probably myself.
Oh, wow. What's your favorite four-letter word?
Food.
Food. What's your favorite dessert then?
Oh, tiramisu.
Tiramisu. Oh my God. And finally, what's your favorite holiday spot in the world?
Ghana.
Ghana.
100%.
Ghana.
Yeah.
Well, Francis, thank you. This has been a fascinating conversation, really, really rich, research informed, and very much perspectival, and also a challenge and a chastening of our education system that we must continue to do right by our young people, but also the people who work in those spaces. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you for having me.